Hey guys, it's Dr. Kurtz with Sunny Coast Vet, and I wanted to welcome you to our first ever Dinner with the Doc. And what we're doing is a bunch of Facebook Live posts, and it's really open for anything. We're going to have some formal ones and some informal ones, but tonight we're going to start off with strategic deworming for the responsible pet owner. And so basically with these Facebook Live events, like I said, this is the first time we've ever done it. The cool thing is you can post questions or you can ask questions during the event. It is my first one, so I may not get to your questions during the actual event, but I promise I'll read through and try to answer questions if you do have them, after I get done with the event. The other thing is that we're doing a special raffle. So anytime that you make a comment or you RSVP to the event, we're going to do raffles. And so for this event, the raffle we are going to do is a strategic deworming package, which is up to $100 value and includes some fecals and some dewormers and stuff like that. And then following this blog post, which will be available whenever you want to view it, but following this video, you can also check our website and look for blog posts, because strategic deworming, there's a lot to it, and there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of parasites and stuff like that. I think when I took this course in school, it was like 3 hours long, and nobody wants to listen to me for 3 hours. But if you look on our blog post, you'll all see, a very long, detailed thing. So definitely read over that, and if you have any questions, we'll follow up with that. So I'll briefly kind of just talk about what strategic deworming is. I've kind of broken it apart into different sections. But basically, this is a fairly new protocol that's kind of been developed because of the problem we've had with parasites with resistance. So basically what we take into account is our geographical location. So it's really important, are we in the southeast U.S., the northeast U.S., all those different things. And then also we really have to consider the age, the health of a horse that we're going to be treating, plus the actual burden of parasites that they have. And also a big part of this is selecting the appropriate deworming, and probably the biggest thing is timing it. So actually when we're using the dewormers, we have the most effect, and we try the hardest to kind of do all that stuff. So before I kind of dive in with all these things on strategic deworming, what I'm going to talk about first is the parasites that we most commonly deal with, which I'm always saying, common things happen commonly. So kind of what this talk is about is common parasites that we deal with in Florida in a healthy adult horse that really isn't having any health problems or things like that. So we'll dive in. So the first parasite we're going to talk about are small strongyles. And what those are small little worms. They're about 1 inch long, they're red, and they typically inhabit the large intestine of horses. These parasites are known as thieves versus actual killers. And so what that means is they kind of rob horses of their nutrients. So typically what it causes horses to be is ill thrifty. Sometimes they can have like loose stool or even diarrhea, sometimes get a little colicky, those things. The nice thing about small strongyles is the larva is actually really easy to kill on pastures with extreme climates, which is really good in Florida because during the summer they can't survive in the heat and do that. If you're talking about more up north, they can't survive in the pastures during the wintertime. So that really helps us with them. And when we do things that, timing with dewormers, this one has a really significant, we can really time that really well. So kind of the season we talk about for small strongyles being really active in Florida is kind of November to April is typical timing. So the next one we'll talk about is something called large roundworms. This is pretty commonly known as Ascarids. And so what these are very long tan worms. They're about 6 to 9 inches long, which is huge. And really they tend to affect more foals and immune compromised animals. Research has showed that most adult horses who are healthy actually develop an immunity to these things. So we don't actually have to worry about them as much in adult horses that are healthy. And these guys like to invade the small intestine. The problem with large roundworms or ascarids, is they actually don't have a great kill season, that they're pretty hardy against most types of weather. So that's hot and cold. And so typically, in foals, they are infected with the larvae or the eggs that live on the pasture from last year. So that's what they're tricky little buggers. And these are definitely more dangerous worms in the fact that they're so big, and then they can really not rob foals of nutrition. So typically with them, we see the same thing, weight loss. Based on their migration and their life cycle, we can sometimes see snotty noses or pneumonia-like signs in foals. But the big thing that these guys do is they cause colic. And just kind of if you think about in the small intestine of a horse, if you have a large amount of worms, 6 to 9 inches long, that if they can actually cause impaction colics if they're in the system and they cause a blockage in that small intestine. Now, these next couple parasites that we have, they're a little bit more difficult to find on fecal floats, but they're also a little bit more easy to treat with our current dewormers. So the first one is Gasterophilus, which is also commonly known as a bot. So these they're the egg and larva stage of a botfly. And actually, botflies to horses are not very parasitic. They just use horses during their life cycle. So where horses pick them up and have issues is actually the larva of those botflies. And what the botflies do is they lay these really sticky yellow egg packets on horses, usually their front legs or chest, near their mouth, those sorts of things. And what the horses will do is that they'll somehow ingest them, either that they'll lick them or do something like that, and then they're in their intestinal tract. And these guys really like to hang out in the stomach and the small intestine. And really the biggest side effect we get is where they tend to attach is they cause really severe ulceration. And so usually side effects from these guys is that, you'll have a horse that acts, ulcery, sometimes a little colicky, those sorts of things. And these guys are really hard to find on fecal just because it depends on how they shed. And so kind of with them, to identify them, we kind of look at them, the horses on the outside, and we look for those egg packets or, those botfly eggs. And then the other thing we can do is we can pass an endoscope down. And so we use a camera to look in the horse's stomach. And a lot of times you can see these guys, and it's kind of amazing the damage they can do to the lining of that stomach. The nice thing is, like I said, they're really easily treated with most of our dewormers and don't have as big of a resistance problem as some of those other parasites I talked about before. So typically if we treat once a year, we can take care of those. The other thing are when they're done, the larvae are done in the small intestine, they're actually passed in the feces, and that's where they pupate and then become the adult flies. So on that one, manure management really helps control that life cycle. And the last one I'm going to talk about are tapeworms, and I think everybody knows what a tapeworm is. Every species of animals has different tapeworms. The ones in horses like to inhabit the small intestine and the ceca. And usually horses can have a fair amount of these and not have any clinical signs until okay. But if they have a really heavy burden, that causes those horses to kind of be poor doers, that they have a dull hair coat, or they may be thin, they may act like an ulcery horse, those sorts of things. And like the bots, they're really hard to find on fecals. But the good news about tapeworms is we have a really good medication or a dewormer for them, and we can treat for them once a year and usually take care of that problem. So those are the worms I'm going to talk about. And like I said, we deal with lots of different parasites, but those are the most common ones that we deal with in Florida, and they're kind of the most aggravating, for me as a vet to kind of handle and deal with. So now we'll jump into strategic deworming. So basically, strategic deworming is based on the theory of something called refugia. And what refugia is, the actual definition, is the natural population of parasites in a horse or environment which are unexposed to dewormer. And so where this comes into kind of a big play is that we know that worms are getting more and more resistant to our dewormers. And the problem that we're really having is there's no new dewormers in development. So kind of what we have is what we have to use. And so with this theory of refugia is that we want this kind of naive population of parasites, which are very susceptible to our dewormers, to kind of be the mass majority of parasites that we have in our horse's system versus the resistant parasites. And so that's where, you know, you might have heard your vets before saying that it's okay for your horse to have a few parasites. Like, we don't panic if, you know, say we do a fecal float and we see a couple of, you know, small strongyle eggs. We don't necessarily panic about that. But that's where that kind of comes into theory with that. And so I made up this little drawing, which I don't know if you'll be able to see it really well. But basically it talks about the problem we're dealing with dewormers and resistant worms. So basically we have here, this is awkward, I think you can see it, it's crooked, there we go. So basically we have up here generation 1 with 100 adult worms, and like I said, it's a very simplified, easy numbers, because that's always important, and, you know, kind of easy theory. So generation 1 we have, you know, with a horse has 100 adult worms, so we use dewormer A on it. And so from that dewormer, it's, say, 85% effective. So kills 85 of those original 100 worms, but at least 15 of those worms that survive. So what that basically kind of tells you is that they have the genes to be resistant to that type of dewormer. And parasites are just like every other species. You know, they're just like bacteria, viruses, people, animals, that they are genetically diverse. So what we're basically doing there is natural. I'm having a hard time with the camera and keeping it straight. Anyways, so these guys, for some reason, due to natural selection, 15 of those worms survive. Well, they're basically going to pass their genes on to those worms that they reproduce with. So in generation 2, we have 150 adult worms, and we again use the same dewormer, dewormer A. Well, from there, we'll have 50 surviving worms. So it's not as the percentage of the dewormer is not as effective. It's not killing as nearly high of a percentage as the first time. But we will have 100 dead worms. The mass majority of them are going to be affected by this dewormer. But where that comes into effect is actually generation 3, which, say that generation we have 500 adult worms. So 500 worms, when they're reproducing and passing on those genes to be resistant to dewormers, well, then when we use that same dewormer, now about 50% of the worms have that resistance gene. So that's where it quickly can snowball on you, and that's why we're sitting there and we're like, oh, there's nothing down the line coming in terms of dewormers. So we have to really get aggressive on, you know, changing our theory on our dewormers. And so basically, kind of summing that all up, those worms that have the greatest ability to withstand the dewormer will survive, and then they will reproduce. So with refugia, and kind of tying it all in, what we're going to try to do is have those naive worms that have not, you know, do not have that resistance genes against the dewormer in that population with those resistant genes, and kind of try to dilute it out, basically. And so what does that mean for you on your farm? Because that's like a lot of different things, and you're like, well, we know that 20% of the horses in a herd shed 80% of the parasites in that environment. So what that means for you as a horse owner is that if you're doing a rotational dewormer and you're deworming every 6 to 8 weeks, or you're doing a daily dewormer, you're over-treating the mass majority of horses in your herd. And then your horses that actually have a large parasite burden, you're probably under-treating them. And so when you do that with the over-treating, you know, most, but then under-treating some, you're creating that huge resistance problems. And that's why a lot of times we can see it on farms that they actually have different problems with resistance. And so that's where strategic deworming comes in. And it's also, I know it's a very frustrating thing, because I know when I was growing up and we had horses, you know, we were always taught, you know, deworm them every 6 to 8 weeks and be very aggressive with the dewormer, use the harshest dewormer that you can, deworm them year-round, do all that. And we know that that's actually a pretty big issue with that. So with strategic deworming, what we do is we want to ID the high shedders in our herd. And so we do this by using a variety of different tests. Probably the most common and most economical is a fecal float. And so what we take is a poop sample from your horse, and then we use a super saturated or very concentrated solution, and we get those eggs to kind of float up in the solution, and then we can look for them. This is most effective on those small strongyles and the Ascarids. Like I said, the tapeworms are really hard to see, and the bots are also really hard to see. Another thing we can do is a fecal egg count. So what we do is we send off a fecal sample from your horse, and then we put it on a little gridded slide, and then you do this kind of same thing, and you actually can physically count each of the eggs. And same thing, that you can kind of identify a horse that is a low, moderate, or high shedder. And then another test that we can do is what we call a fecal egg count reduction test. And basically what that tells us is resistance in a horse or a herd. And so basically what we do is we do a fecal egg count, deworm the horse, and then come back, 10 to 14 days later and repeat a fecal egg count and see and make sure that those eggs per gram have decreased between the two fecal egg counts. Another really big part of strategic deworming is really IDing efficacy of dewormer against the parasites in that farm. So that's where the fecal egg count reduction tests come in, and doing those things. And finally, it's creating a timeline when it's best to deworm the horses based on the parasite's life cycle. So like I talked about before, in Florida, we don't have to worry as much about parasites being really active in the summer because it's just so hot here. So like I said, it kind of throwing a bunch of dewormer in your horse in the summertime doesn't quite make sense. And just like with tapeworms that require that special medication, well, if you deworm at the wrong time of year, you may be overtreating your horse. So that's where the theory of strategic deworming comes in. Now, so I'm going to go over kind of the different things for the strategic deworming, and talk about that in Florida. And this is very important because it's specific for Florida, and really the Southeast, but Florida. Because like I said, up north, their parasite season is a lot different from ours because their harshest climate is in the wintertime, where that's like our ideal time for parasites to be alive and thriving down here. And then this is kind of what all of these theories do is the cycle basically starts in October. And we start with a fecal for everybody, no matter what, with your horse. No matter if they've been previously a low shedder, a high shedder, a moderate shedder, whatever. And so the reason why we do that is because things can change, in terms of, was your horse a low shedder last year, and then say they had an immune compromising event, and now that they're a little bit more susceptible to those worms, maybe. I've also had clients that they thought that they were giving the dewormer to a horse, and say for some reason the horse spit out the dewormer. So they started to, follow the correct, schedule, and then the horse was clucking and stuff like that and wasn't acting right. And with that horse, we actually passed the scope, and it had a bunch of bots. And so that horse, we guessed that it just probably spit out the dewormer, or didn't get, got skipped in a herd or something like that. So always start the cycle in October and start it with a fecal. And then typically what we do is, even though we do a fecal, we do deworm them, deworm every horse. And the reason why we want to start that in October or the fall is because that's when tapeworms are excisted, and they're actually really susceptible to dewormer. Now, tapeworms require a special kind of dewormer called praziquantel, which is actually just a drug and a couple different medications. So that's the Mectrin Gold or Quest Plus. They both have that ingredient, praziquantel. And so that's why it's really important, I always say, no matter what, always, in the South, hit your horses with praziquantel in the fall, because that's the best time of year for tapes. And then on those horses and the purpose of that fecal in October is to identify your horse into a different categories. So either a low shedder, a moderate shedder, or a high shedder. Now, just because your horse is in, say, one of those categories, it doesn't mean that it can't move. Typically, if they're a low shedder, they stay a low shedder. But, if you have a horse that's a moderate shedder, we can get them down to be a low shedder. And same thing for a high shedder. But we just kind of have different protocols for different those. So say we, did the fecal on a horse, we identify that he's a low shedder in October. So we would deworm with medication with praziquantel, so Quest Plus, the Mectrin Gold. Then what we would do is just deworm them again, we would do a fecal again, on January 1st or early spring. And so we would just want to check and make sure that he is a low shedder still. We would also deworm at that time with a moxidectin product, which is typically Quest, just to kind of cover our basis. And then I also repeat a fecal in late spring, so June, before it gets hot again, and just make sure that we're going into that summer with a low parasite burden. So typically, your horses that are your low shedders, we do 3 fecals a year and 2 dewormings a year. Now, if they're a moderate shedder, that's a very similar protocol. And like I said, our goal with moderate shedders is to make them low shedders eventually. But same thing where we start the cycle on October 1st, run a fecal, praziquantel in October, and then followed up with a fecal, and then moxidectin in January. Now, high shedders is where it gets a little bit complicated. And so basically with high shedders, same thing, that we do their first fecal in the month of October, and then hit them with a dewormer that has praziquantel in it. But where it kind of differs is that we actually start using some more kind of those tough guns of dewormers, so oxybenzole, and we do that, say, in December. We come back and do a fecal again in January, and then we hit them again with more oxybenzole, and do that and kind of alternate that. The big thing that I do with my horses that are high shedders is I actually come back about 10 to 14 days after we deworm them and retake a fecal on them, just to make sure that we're making progress with the amount of eggs that I'm seeing in the fecal, because if not, if we don't seem to be making progress, that would tell me that that horse for some reason is having a resistance problem. So is it that they're not getting the dewormer appropriately? Maybe. Is it that they're actually resistant to the dewormer and we may need to switch things up? That's also a real possibility. So that's the biggest thing for those high shedders. And like I said, typically we try to get those high shedders to moderate shedders and hopefully eventually to be a low shedders, but that's something that usually it takes a couple of years to do. It's not something that that it's just one season to the next. That kind of happens. And so kind of where this differs, so like I said, this is for a healthy adult horse in Florida. It will differ a little bit if you have a pregnant mare. So typically they follow a very similar schedule. However, we always want to hit them with a praziquantel product, so Zimetron and Quest Plus and Zimetron Gold. And we want to do that, 30 days before they're foaling, 4 to 6 weeks before they're foaling. And the other one that's really different are foals. And the reason why is foals, one, that they have lots of problems with Ascarids, and their immune systems just aren't as good. And so with foals, we usually deworm them every 2 months until they're yearlings. And so that's what, with pregnant mares and foals, always ask your veterinarian. And if you have something like a high shedder, that's always one that ask your veterinarian about too. And I always tell people that, horses should not be clinical for worms. So if we have, if I have a horse that's, not gaining weight appropriately or doing something, a lot of times I jump to parasites first and want to check those. And so we had a couple of questions, and I'm not seeing questions yet. So anyways, but we did have a couple of questions before we started this. And these questions were kind of about fecal egg counts. And like I said, we do fecal floats, which kind of gives us more of, I would say, a qualitative measure. I still rank them, and it is quantitative. So I would say I usually rank my fecal floats on a range from 1 to 4. 1 being that, very low number of parasites, or what you would call low shedder. And then 4 is a high shedder, obviously. But fecal egg counts, and I think their question was along the lines of, kind of what you do is if you had a high shedder in the past, and then, kind of from there, when do we call them low? When do we kind of change things? And so on fecal egg counts, it's a big number. And so, fecal egg counts, you have low, which is 0 to 99 eggs per gram, which is how many eggs they count on that little gridded things. And then a moderate shedder is 100 to 499 eggs. And so a lot of people, and I think that with a horse being a moderate shedder, that's the one that gets a little bit confusing about to deworm or not. Because like I talked about with a low shedder, I'm not really concerned about if a horse is a low shedder and doesn't have a huge parasite burden. Even if they have a couple, I'm not worried about it. A moderate shedder, that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because on a horse that's shedding a large amount of parasites, of course you're going to hit them with a dewormer and be very aggressive about that. But I would even say like a low moderate. So moderate goes from 100 to 499. So if a horse is 100, I probably would just monitor that and do a repeat fecal egg counts and kind of measure that and keep it track along that way. However, when it starts to get to the upper ends of moderate is where I actually think about deworming and doing that, especially if the horse is clinical. If I looked at a horse that is kind of a poor doer, or kind of acts a little stomach ulcery, and then has a large amount of, a moderate amount of worms, I probably would say, let's go ahead and give them a dewormer. And then if it's a high shedder, so greater than 500 eggs per gram, then of course we would do deworming. But then again, the other important thing is environmental changes. So the other thing that the question that we had was, if you've had a high shedder, how many times do you need to retest them to get them to make sure they're back into being a low shedder? And so I would say on that one that you have to do a series of counts and measure that. Because the problem that we run into, like I talked about before, sometimes you have a poor sample. So, there wasn't a large amount of, for whatever reason, of that parasite in the fecal sample you have, or that the horse may be cycling through and they have a lot of immature eggs, and so you're not seeing a lot of those in your fecal either. So it's really quick and easy to cause, sorry, see, I was telling you multitasking, and I was trying to read a comment. Are there anything? Oh, and we'll talk about your question next too. So anyways, you can tell I need to practice on multitasking. So I would say, I would want to repeat the fecal several times before I definitively say, okay, now this horse is a low shedder. And like I talked about before, we don't immediately do that. So are there any things I should look for before I get deworming done? So I would say every horse in Florida should have a fecal done in October. And I always tell this story, which I probably shouldn't say it online because it's pretty embarrassing. But I had my horse, I lived on a horse farm, and part of our board was that they dewormed her, and they were on a rotational dewormer schedule, and they did really well. And in vet school, we could bring in fecal samples from our own animals, and I brought in my fecal sample from my horse, and she was loaded with worms. So she was loaded with small strongyles, which is kind of embarrassing. But anyways, but that's why every horse should have, fecal done. And like I said earlier, it takes a pretty high, minus those Ascarids and young foals, it takes a pretty high, amount of parasites for them to be clinical. So that's what I would say, I would always do a fecal, because, you can kind of have those horses that you wouldn't know that they have a huge parasite. My horse looked great. Like I had no clue. And maybe what happened was that when she was on that deworming cycle, she got skipped, or maybe she spit it out. I don't know. But anyways, that was embarrassing. And then I'm reading the next one. I read that if you compost manure, and that's true about your composting. And so that's what, kind of the composting question, that's kind of along those lines of some of those horses are a lot of the small strongyles and bots and stuff like that are very, susceptible to heat. The only one that really is really strong in the environment are, like I talked about before, the Ascarids. But if you don't have a lot of young horses running around, that's not a huge issue. My sister's commenting now, so she's in trouble. How quickly can a horse go down from parasites? That's a tough question, because one, it depends on the type of parasite. And so Ascarids, horses can go down very quickly from those. I had a horse that also went down, she actually ended up rupturing her stomach from bots. So she was on and off colicky, we were treating her, and she ended up rupturing her stomach from the ulceration. And this was, people that didn't have a lot of money, so they couldn't do a lot of the workup and diagnostics. And so she came in with a lot of stomach ulcers, and was acting like a stomach ulcery horse, but we just it was so bad we didn't get to it on time. So that's what I've seen parasites. I mean, I think, people think, get worried a little bit, sometimes get worried really quickly. But I also think, like I said, horses can tolerate a lot of them, especially healthy adult horses. But I've seen it happen that they can go down really quickly. Can a horse be passed to other animals? Typically not for parasites being passed to other animals, just because a lot of times parasites are pretty, like even when you talk about like the dog tapeworm versus the cat tapeworm, they are different species. So I wouldn't ever say like 100% on that they can't get the deworm, but really weird for it to go across species. And so the nice thing about, like, I know lots of dogs eat horse poop. I don't get it. But, a lot of times your heart guard and your different, heartworm medications in dogs are actually dewormers too. So that's good too. I think that's all the questions. Yes. Anyways, so like I said before, if you have any questions, we'll do our best to answer them quickly. Okay. I thought it was another question. I got scared for a minute. And so kind of we try to time, there's just strategic deworming. We try to time this and this talk in this Facebook Live event because it's October 1st. So it's time for us to start thinking about deworming and strategic deworming and doing fecals and all that stuff. So this is the perfect time of year for that. And so that's why we did the talk tonight. But, if you have any questions, of course, ask them on Facebook Live. But the other thing, if you want to set up an appointment to the feed through. So, oh, sorry, another question. I got distracted. The daily dewormers, it's a tough one because I've actually heard of some people, when we talk about, so daily dewormers used to be like the holy grail. I know when I was a kid, that's what we fed our horses. And so kind of it's getting a little bit frowned upon because the reason I talked about. Those daily dewormers only kill the worms that are susceptible to the dewormer. So over time, you get more and more resistance in each generation. But I've also heard of internal medicine people doing it that say a horse that you have that's really immune compromised, has a really hard time getting rid of those worms and doing that, that they actually do recommend a daily dewormer. So I would say for me personally, I recommend not using a daily dewormer, but I also know that there's special circumstances that I've heard of people, higher up on me in the veterinary medicine chain, talk about doing a daily dewormer. But I would say the newest trend is, it's not, I wouldn't call it frowned upon, but it's less ideal because it is contributing to the parasite resistance problem we're having. And so that's a good question because it's one of those that just kind of is gone out of vogue. Anyways, but good questions, everybody. And like I said, we will, I can answer your questions and if you have more after this. And like I said, check out our website because I have this all written up for you. It's probably a lot more organized than with me answering questions. So I'm sure a little bit less confusing. Anyways, but you can always call our office and set up an appointment to have us do, fecals and look at your horses and kind of look at, do physicals and do that. Our office number is 941-312-7766. And thanks for joining me.